welcome, and thank you so much for joining the World Affairs Council of Connecticut today to discuss how civil rights has always been a global movement with special guest Dr. Brenda Gayle Plummer. Dr. Brenda Gayle Plummer is a foundational scholar in the realm of race and international relations. She's an author and professor of history at University of Wisconsin-Madison in the departments of history and Afro-American studies. Dr. Plummer, we were just talking about, previously served on the Historical Advisory Committee of the U.S. State Department, which consults with the State Department on historical declassification issues. And today's discussion is inspired by Dr. Plummer's June 2020 article in Foreign Affairs, Civil Rights Has Always Been a Global Movement, How Allies Abroad Help the Fight Against Racism at Home. Dr. Plummer, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
We're thrilled to have you here with us. My name is Amanda Jolly, for everyone out there, VP of Programs with the Council, and today's episode of State of the World is hosted along with several partners, and we want to thank them all. Thank you to the Greater Hartford Links Chapter, to the Central Connecticut State University Political Science Department, African American Studies Department, Africana Center, and International Studies Department. And that's a huge thank you in particular to Dr. Walton Brown Foster, professor in the Department of Political Science and African American and International Studies at CCSU. Thank you for all your partnership. So we're honored to have Dr. Plummer here today to discuss the global reaction to the murder of George Floyd and why the movement for civil rights has always been global. So let's get started. I'm pleased to turn it over to Megan Torrey, CEO of the World Affairs Council.
Thanks, Amanda, and welcome, Dr. Plummer.
Thank you.
We are so delighted to have you with us today. It's always a timely topic, but it seems completely even more poignant this week. So Dr. Plummer, you wrote the article that Amanda referenced before, Civil Rights Has Always Been a Global Movement, in June of 2020. Mm-hmm. Since its publishing, protests have swept the nation, as has backlash to protests. In recent weeks, we've seen voter suppression laws enacted and more on the books around the United States. The trial of Derek Chauvin is going on right now. We know that this morning, the defense tried to get the case acquitted. And on Sunday, a police officer in Minnesota tragically shot and killed 20-year-old Dante Wright during a traffic stop. Can you share with us your perspective? What do these events tell us about where we are today and compared to where we were, in June 2020 when you wrote the article?
Okay. Well, it seems to me that there have been two major events since June of 2020. One of them is, certainly the presidential election. Another, I believe, that has been critical and may in fact, be something of a turning point, is the January 6th attack on the national Capitol, which I think in spite of a sprinkling of people of color present, was essentially a white supremacist event. And if we put that in conversation with the voter suppression laws, we see a tragic return to a kind of America that we are hoping to change. Now, luckily for us, there has been some pushback to all of that. There is some indication that the present presidential administration is more amenable to pursuing criminal justice reform. And there's also an indication that major corporations are behind an effort to get state legislatures to roll back these attempts to keep people from voting. I don't think we can say that there is so much forward movement, but so much as a back and forth that we are going to have to contend with in the near future.
Absolutely. So you wrote in that article that global condemnation of racist violence by United States law enforcement is not new, but the extraordinary scale and reach of the reaction to George Floyd's death represents an order of magnitude shift. Can you tell us more about these reactions globally and where did you see protests spread across the world?
Okay. Well, I think most of the world's audience that's attentive to what takes place in the United States is already aware of the problem of American racism generally. I think there were a couple of things that triggered the George Floyd reaction. One of them is that people all over the world have been under pressure as a result of the pandemic and as a result of varying governmental responses to it. So there's sort of a climate, I think, that was more open to sensitivity and indignation to these kinds of abuses. Right? I think there's also in the world community some I don't know, bewilderment, we'll call it, over U.S. gun culture. And the way that this violence seems to repeat itself in the United States. Other countries allow their citizens to bear arms, but the United States seems to be the only place where we have almost weekly mass shootings. I think there are also many countries have similar racial issues. Immigrants from Asia and Africa, come to European countries, just as they come to the United States. And some of the racial conflicts that exist in the United States have something of a counterpart in other countries. I also think that part of it is that there's always a desire on the part of critics of the United States and the United States' enemies to exploit situations which will embarrass the United States. So there's always that element. Even after the Cold War, we see that the United States is subjected to criticism, particularly on racial questions. So I think this is why there was a sort of global reaction to the George Floyd situation. And part of the international spread is because it reached sensitivities in other countries that also developed Black Lives Matter movements that also experienced conflict between communities of color and the police and so on.
It's true. I know that Walton, who's joining us, recently worked with the Links, our local chapter of the Links, to present some global Black Lives Matter activists. I know one from the UK and one from Nigeria. So absolutely true. So let's talk a little bit about historical context in the role of African Americans in U.S. foreign policy. So historically, and they've been historically and too often ignored, you write. And I want you to talk a little bit about two different narratives. Can you tell us a little bit about the international activism of Frederick Douglass?
Well, as some people may know, the United Kingdom, I don't know if they called themselves that at the time, but Britain was some 30 years ahead in abolishing slavery than the United States was. And so they provided then an audience for anti-slavery sentiment and activism that American abolitionists could hook into. So Frederick Douglass was among those abolitionists who went to Britain and to Ireland to speak to audiences about slavery in the United States, to try to create international pressure on the United States to abolish slavery. So when we talk about African Americans and foreign affairs, we can look back to the anti-slavery movement as one of the first campaigns in which this kind of activism was present.
Talk a little bit as well about Ida B. Wells.
Well, after slavery was abolished, African Americans were not out of the woods. States in which slavery had been, a major part of the economy and even many northern states passed laws referred to as Jim Crow laws that it subjected African Americans to discriminatory treatment, prevented them from voting, representing themselves in court, so on and so forth. One major aspect of this Jim Crow regime was lynching, the extrajudicial killing of people on various pretexts. Right? So Ida B. Wells, a journalist from Memphis originally, also traveled to Britain to try to arouse British opinion against this practice and to have Britain's weigh in an attempt to influence the United States to eliminate it.
So let's talk about the civil rights movements in the United States. African American activists and people of color in the US have used the global stage to advance the cause of civil rights movements in the US.
Mm-hmm.
How have activists used global allies and used, as you write, the threat of humiliation on the international stage to hold the US policymakers accountable?
Mm-hmm. Well, if we fast forward to the 20th century, one of the things that we find is that African Americans not only make use of international contacts for the purposes of moral suasion, if you want to call it that, but also to get ideas about how they might deal with the United States at home. So we find, for example, that as early as the 1930s, there are African Americans who go to India. I'm thinking particularly of the Reverend Howard Thurman here, to network with Mahatma Gandhi, who is noted as not only as a Hindu ascetic, but also someone who devised strategies for dealing with getting India out of the British Empire. Right? Gandhi was an advocate of nonviolent civil disobedience, and he advocated that as a strategy for African Americans to follow. After Gandhi died, we find that members of the India Congress Party, and particularly Nehru and Vijaya Pandit, were also encouraging strategies that had worked in India to be applied to the situation in the United States. In 1959, Martin Luther King goes to India, lays a wreath on Gandhi's grave, right? And he was also committed to the strategy of nonviolent civil disobedience. So we see, in addition to using international ties to attempt to influence the United States, those ties were also used as a way of sort of gathering possibilities for how African Americans might deal with the situation that they found themselves in.
So I want to bring in a question from Nicole, who asks if you are able to provide a historical context of the way the international community responded to civil rights movements in the 50s and 60s. And are we seeing a similar reaction globally today?
Well, one of the differences between today and then was the Cold War. And so the United States was in the business of attempting to line up those countries that expressed an interest in not being aligned to, in fact, ally themselves with the Western camp, the Western democracies, against those countries of the Warsaw Pact. And so, criticism was coming from the United States, not only from its enemies who were allied with the Soviet Union, but also from potential friends who were very sensitive about this question of race. India was one, but we also find that after 1960, there are some 17 new independent African countries. And American diplomats in those countries found themselves being frequently questioned about race relations in the United States, particularly after, various crises and, events like the Little Rock crisis, for example, or the Birmingham violence in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. So the global community was aware and concerned about American conditions, and also very interested in having the United States, ally its ideology with its actual practice on the ground.
So I want to bring in also a question from Haley, who wants to know sort of why do we talk about the civil rights movement as only sort of an American occurrence? Are we limiting it by not putting it in a broader global context?
Well, it depends on what your aim is in talking about. I mean, there as the card catalog will tell us thousands and thousands of books and articles about the civil rights movement. So, putting it into international context is one way of looking at it. I mean, you could look at civil rights insurgency through a very local lens, looking at how it affected a particular town or state or region, or you could look at it in international perspective. But if you're talking about civil rights in other countries, then you have to be aware and focused on the specific situations of other countries, and not simply assume that the same variables or conditions apply in the United States.
So you talked a little bit about the insurrection at the United States Capitol on January 6th. And so today we see white supremacy threatening African Americans and people of color across our nation. As efforts to break down white supremacy continue, are you seeing an increase in solidarity between people of color across the nation and around the world?
I think it's interesting that you asked this question, because we were talking about this in a seminar yesterday. Right? I think what is happening in this country is that the sort of precarious middleman position of non-Black people of color is being eroded. One of the ways that the racial system in the United States has been working is that Black people have pretty much been the lowest common denominator as far as social status is concerned. And you have, other people of color who are not Black, who sort of occupy an intermediate position, but that position has always been unstable. Because their status, often depended on immigration and citizenship status, or it depended on particular perceptions by white people of what their entitlements were. For example, in the Southwest, Mexicans were considered white, but they were kept in segregated schools. So there was this indeterminacy about the position of non-Black people of color in the United States, right? Which was never a comfortable position. But I think part of the violence against Asian Americans, I think further destabilizes that, right? As well as recent violence against people of Latin American descent, and also the racialization of Muslims. Right? So I think that these kinds of developments, I think have an impact on, destabilizing the sort of tenuous position that these groups have often found themselves in.
Thank you. And anyone in the audience who wants to ask a question, I just encourage you to use the Q&A function, and I'll try and get to them. So we recently spoke with Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy about his article, A New Civil Rights Movement is a Foreign Policy Win. Can you talk to us about how does the outcome of today's civil rights movement and anti-racist efforts impact the foreign policy power of the United States?
Well, I think there's a seed in there in which the United States could be promoting some change on the civil rights front. It's certainly to the advantage of the United States to be seen as attempting to reform racist institutions. The problem is that we have been this route before. For example, in 1957, American diplomats found themselves apologizing for Little Rock. In 1963, they were apologizing for Birmingham. Right? So, what needs to happen is that the reality of institutional, systematic, and systemic racism needs to be addressed. And until very recently, there was, firm denial on the part of, some elements in American society that these things were even real. So there really has to be some reckoning, I think, along, as far as this is concerned.
So we know that institutional change can happen gradually, right? So sometimes extremely painfully gradually.
Mhm.
Do you see this as an opportunity for a faster pace of change now than we've seen over the past few decades?
Mhm. Well, I've actually been very skeptical about this because, we have had, presidential administrations that were interested in reform on this issue. So, for example, in the mid 60s, after, some of these, globally advertised violent episodes in the United States occurred, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And it appeared to, audiences all over the world, well, something is happening here. The United States is making some progress. Certain African countries dropped their objections and criticism of the United States because they felt the government was making a sincere effort. But then there was a change of administration. And the administration that came in after Johnson's was not terribly interested in enforcing civil rights legislation. And so we get this sort of back and forth, which, leads to these continued cycles of violence, apology, reform, violence, apology, reform. So to me, it seems that the only thing that is really has the possibility of ensuring any lasting reform is going to be demographic change.
So speaking of demographic change, right, we see, sort of diversity in our younger populations in the United States.
Mhm.
And you're a professor. Can you tell us about how do you deal with these issues in the classroom? What are you hearing from your students?
The students that I hear from are very upset by the violence in American life, and with a lot of the irrational thinking that has accompanied the responses to the pandemic, with the unwillingness of large parts of the public and leadership to deal with current crises that affect the country. As far as the demographics are concerned, I think it's important that I think we're up to about 35% now of Americans are people of color. and that there are a growing number of states, I don't know offhand how many, but in which no racial ethnic group is in the majority. And referred to as majority minority states or minority majority states. The point being that I think that it is this that will that has the potential of changing the situation in the United States. Not tentative and temporary reform measures followed up by backlashes, right? But rather a growing enfranchised population of people who have a stake in substantive and genuine change.
So as we're sort of running out of time and we're up to our last question, I want to ask you if you had to sort of make suggestions on how we can move forward. What are some, nationwide, domestically, some of the most important steps that we can take?
Mm-hmm.
And what would you tell us as individuals that we can do as we all try to move forward?
Well, it certainly seems to me that laws that facilitate rather than block voting are essential. I think there should also be some national standards for police training. We have a unified code of military justice. The idea, of course, is that police are local forces, but it seems to me that it should not be impossible to impose certain standards of training and deportment on the part of police officers. And as far as what people can do individually, I think it's really is important to vote, and not only just in for the president, say, but also even in local elections, a dog catcher. Because one of the problems is the erosion of the civic sphere. And the sort of marketplace for ideas. Some of this it presently can't be helped because, for example, the technological change has led to the decline of newspapers in large parts of the country. People depend on a lot of dodgy online news sources. But I think maybe part of the antidote to this is some form of community in which people can engage in political discussion and participate in the electoral process.
Dr. Plummer, it was an honor and a pleasure to have you with us today for this extremely important discussion. And I'm so grateful for you for sharing your insight, your expertise on this issue, and hopefully we can have you back again.
Well, thank you so much.
Dr. Plummer, just to echo Megan, thank you so much for speaking with us today. And a huge thank you to everyone for joining us. This discussion is an event of the Council's State of the World series. So coming up, we'll tackle everything from US-China competition in strategic domains to a young professional event on sports diplomacy. And we invite you to join us next week when we'll be having an analysis on the crises to watch in the Horn of Africa in 2021. So we invite you to join us next week. You can visit our website at ctwac.org to join in future live events. And you'll find this event on our podcast and on our YouTube channel. So please visit the World Affairs Council of Connecticut on YouTube to revisit this conversation, see any future or past episodes, and State of the World, wherever you get your podcast, to again revisit this conversation. So thank you so much, Dr. Plummer. Thank you so much for being here today.